Welcome back, everyone. Today we're gonna be transforming hats into winter hats, and I have two different styles I wanna show you. Both are super easy to do, and you can do it with any hat. So if you have a couple old hats laying around, grab that free pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you'll need a 1/4 yard for your main fabric, and this fabric can vary. You can use flannel, wool, sherpa. It really all depends on how fluffy you want to make the flap. So if you live in a colder environment, you might want to find something that's a little bit warmer. I'm going to be using a very thin flannel. I found that it worked great, and it made for a thinner flap on the side so you don't get too hot. And definitely leave in the comments if you found a fabric that works really good. But like always, use whatever fabric that's going to make your design come together. You'll need a 1/4 yard for your secondary fabric, and this is a fabric that's going to be on the inside. I'm going to be using a thinner flannel, same as my main fabric. You can actually double up and use the same fabric for both. I didn't want to get anything too bulky because I'm trying to keep these flaps on the thinner side. You'll need 10 to 20 inches of drawstring. For style 1, this is going to be for the front, and style 2, it's going to be for the ties at the bottom. You can use any style of drawstring. I'm going to be using a standard paracord. It works great and is very durable. If you're making style 1, you'll need 2 eyelets. And these eyelets can be any size. As long as they fit on that panel, you're good to go. You'll also need a cap of any style. This technique works on 5 panels, 6 panels, fitted caps, pretty much any style of baseball cap. You can de-thread that side and put in your flaps. And lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use and it's free. All you have to do is download it, print it off, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And before you tape your pattern together, the best thing to do is to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is going to allow you to overlap those pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. Once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting. And after taping your pattern together, it should look like this. Be sure to check your printer alignment for the best possible results. As you can see, we have style 1 and style 2. We're going to start the video off by making style 1. Before you cut the pattern out, there's 2 ways to make it. You can either use bias tape or you can sew the panels together. If you're using bias tape, cut on the dash line. If you're not, cut on the black line. And don't worry, I'll be going over both techniques. The second thing, you're going to want to adjust it to your hat size. More than likely, this size will work, but sometimes you might have to shorten it to the circumference of your hat. And I'll go more over this before we start sewing. And after cutting out your panels for style 1, you should end up with 2 ear cover panels, 1 cut out of your secondary fabric and 1 cut out of your main fabric. And lastly, 4 ear cover side panels, all cut out of your secondary fabric. Before we start sewing, the first thing you want to do is grab your ear cover panels and just wrap it around your hat to get the sizing. You only need 1 so you can place the secondary fabric off to the side, open it up, wrap it around the back of the hat so the sides meet in center front. And this is where you might have to make a little bit of adjusting. You don't want these panels to touch in center front. If you have a 1 to 2 inch gap, that's fine. I prefer like a 4-inch gap in front because I like to pull it tight at the end with the drawstring for a more secure fit. But it all comes down to preference. You can play around with the sizing to find your best fit. There's a few ways you can do this. You can fold it in half and trim in from the sides, or you can cut a new piece and go in from the fold. But once you found that sweet spot, you can grab your secondary panel, and we're going to start off by sewing these panels together and doing the bias tape second. Remember, you cut on the black line because you need to include the seam allowance. So place the right sides together, and we're going to stitch the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving a 2 inch to 4 inch gap in the bottom half. Take your time as you're sewing around those corners, try to make it as neat as possible, and once you get to that bottom section, you're going to want to do a tack stitch, stop, go about 4 inches, tack stitch, and start again. After finishing up the stitch, double check to make sure all the layers got stitched together, find that bottom opening, flip the right sides out, go back to the opening, and we're going to roll the edges in on themselves so the right sides are together. I like to place a few pins on the opening and then also on the flat surface so the layers stay even as you're sewing. Then we're going to add a top stitch all the way around that outside edge. You can stitch as close to the edge as you want. It really comes down to preference and how you like your top stitches to look. I also recommend using the edge presser foot for a nice even stitch. And that's going to complete method 1 of sewing the ear cover panel together without bias tape. Next, we're going to move into the bias tape technique. And if you are using bias tape, you're going to cut on the dashed line. Place the panels with wrong sides together, lining up the outside edges. And we're simply just going to add bias tape. There are quite a few ways of doing this. I show those techniques in other videos. But for this one, we're just going to be using the double fold bias tape binder. You can get this for both domestic and industrial machines. And you want the double fold if you're using the same fabric because you don't want the raw edge exposed. To finish it off, I sew back over the start point, trim it flush with the edge, and tack stitch it down. If you plan on making a lot of these, I highly recommend using the double fold bias tape technique. At this point, the rest of the construction is the same for both of these methods, so whether you sewed yours together or use bias tape, you can follow along from this point. The next step is adding eyelets, and I'm using a 1/4 inch eyelet. I found it was a good size and it worked with my drawstring, but feel free to play around and use bigger eyelets. And we want to place these about 1 inch away from the outside edge in the center of the panel. I like to chalk mine out so I can get a visual on how it looks. Then we're going to punch the holes, place the eyelets. For this video, I'm using a standard hammer die. It's super easy to use. It typically comes with the eyelets. Simply just place the front side of the eyelet on the base and hammer in the back. And repeat this step for the opposite side. If you are using a lighter weight fabric, I do recommend using interfacing. Sometimes those eyelets can pop out, so it's nice to have a little bit of extra structure for those eyelets to grab onto. But for now, you can place this panel off to the side and grab your ear cover side panel. Lay each panel out with right sides facing up, and then we're going to place the right sides together, creating 2 ear cover side panels. And stitch just the side edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After stitching, we're going to flip the right sides out, add a top stitch to the side seams, and we're going to clean up the top and bottom edges by serging. If you don't have a serger, a standard zigzag stitch will work just fine. Doing this will prevent fraying and it will look nicer on the cap. So we can place these panels off to the side and grab the cap you're using. We're trying to just dethread the side from the sweatband. If yours has a top stitch, you want to work on the top stitch first. Not all caps have the top stitch on the side, but it's important to remove it before separating the sweatband. You don't want to accidentally rip the panel. And from there, you dethread in between the panel and the sweatband. And we're trying to dethread the full side so the panel fits in there nice and flat. It's important to grab the panel, throw it in, test it, and see how it fits. Not all hats have the same side length, so you may need to make adjustments to your panel so it fits in there flush. And that's only if it turns out longer. If it turns out shorter, you're totally fine. And I'm going right up to the back snap, but I don't want to dethread it so the back snap falls out. So it may take a little bit of time playing around with this, finding the exact measurements. But once you do, we're going to flip it over to the opposite side and do the same thing. After getting both sides opened up, grab both of your ear cover side panels and we're going to place them within the opening. And we only want the panels to go about 1/4 inch into the hat. This will allow more of the ear cover panel to drop and cover your ear. And before you start sewing, check to make sure the bottom edge of both ear cover side panels are even. From there, you can sew directly on top of the top stitch or as close as you can to the bottom edge of the ball cap. And that's pretty much the trickiest part of this project. Place the cap to the side and grab your ear cover assembly. Again, it's the same installment for both methods. I'm going to be using the bias tape. I'm going to wrap it around the hat, line it up in the center front, and mark on the ear cover panel where it lines up with the side panel. Do this for both sides, and that's going to be our placement guide. Double check your markings, and then we're going to line them up with the front edge of the side panel, and we're laying it flat with right side to the wrong side of the ear cover panel on the bottom edge of the ear cover panel. Place a few pins on both sides, double check the alignment in the front. If everything is looking good, we're going to stitch the bottom edge, locking both of these panels together. And a quick tip, I recommend matching your thread color to your fabric color to hide the stitch. After stitching, double check, make sure it's still aligned. You can try it on, see how it fits. If everything is looking good, grab your drawstring. I'm using paracord. I found it works good and is very durable. Lace it through both of the eyelets and tie a knot. And you can play around with the length and customize it to your fit. And this isn't a final pattern. You can customize it to make it wider so it goes more down the side of your head. You can make it longer or shorter, but the final step is adding branding. I just use a strip of leather and attach it with double-sided rivets. And there's actually a ton of things you can do with this foundation pattern. You can curve the bottom edge to make it look more like an ear flap. You can make it wider, shorter, longer, smaller. Play around with different fabrics and different hats. But anyways, we're gonna place this cap off to the side and start on style 2. For this style, there's only one panel, it's the side panel, and you're going to cut 2 out of your secondary fabric and 2 out of your main fabric. Place the right sides together, grab your drawstring. I'm using a standard paracord. You're going to cut about 2 10-inch strips. You can always trim these down in future steps, so I recommend cutting them a little bit longer. If you're also using paracord, it's nice to burn the ends so they don't unravel. Place the drawstring in between the panels so it's on the right side, line it up in the center. And that's going to be the center of the bottom curve. Leave about 1/4 inch of drawstring sticking out the bottom edge, and we're going to stitch the sides at 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving the top unstitched. And take your time with the stitch. The neater it is, the better it will look when you pop the right sides out. Double check both sides, pop the right sides out, and we're gonna add a top stitch around the outside edge. And just like in the first style, we're gonna clean up that top edge with a serger. For perfect clean top stitching, I recommend using an edge presser foot. And if you don't have a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch. The main goal is to clean up that edge and prevent fraying. As you can see, my panels are super thin. You can actually add another layer in between to beef that up if you're looking for a warmer ear flap. There's a lot you can do, so I recommend testing different fabrics and finding something that works for you. So we can place these panels off to the side and grab the cap you're using. We're trying to just dethread the side from the sweatband. If yours has a top stitch, you want to work on the top stitch first. Not all caps have the top stitch on the side, but it's important to remove it before separating the sweatband. You don't want to accidentally rip the panel. And from there, you dethread in between the panel and the sweatband. And we're trying to dethread the full side so the panel fits in there nice and flat. It's important to grab the panel, throw it in, test it, and see how it fits. Not all hats have the same side length, so you may need to make adjustments to your panel so it fits in there flush. And that's only if it turns out longer. If it turns out shorter, you're totally fine. And I'm going right up to the back snap, but I don't want to dethread it so the back snap falls out. So it may take a little bit of time playing around with this, finding the exact measurements. But once you do, we're going to flip it over to the opposite side and do the same thing. After getting both sides opened up, grab your complete ear flap assemblies. Make sure you have them lined up in the correct orientation of the hat. Slide the panels into the opening 1/4 inch, and we're going to stitch directly on the top stitched area, or if your hat was not top stitched, we're going to stitch as close as we can to that edge. And after finishing up the stitch, double check to make sure the ear flaps line up at the bottom and they're the same length. And if everything lines up, the final step is adding your branding. I'm just using a piece of leather attached with double-sided rivets. And the fun thing about this pattern is that you can actually change up that shape. You can use different fabrics. You can fully customize it to you and your style. And there you have it, your caps are upgraded with ear flaps and ready for the winter. I would love to see what you come up with, so tag me on Instagram at Properfit Clothing, but until then, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.